There's a strange vulnerability in knocking on someone's door, even when it's just down the hall in your own home. You never know what you'll find on the other side. For me, that night, it was David. And the expression on his face changed everything. I hadn't thought twice about it when I walked to his room, barefoot on the cool hardwood floor holding an empty glass in my hand. I'd planned to ask him if he'd left the garden lights on again. A simple question. Nothing more. But when he opened the door, the look in his eyes wasn't what I expected. He stood there in a faded gray t-shirt, the hem wrinkled and clinging to his chest, his hair still damp from a shower. He smelled faintly of soap and something else, something clean and warm. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped me mid-sentence. It was the way he looked at me, unguarded and raw, like I'd caught him in a moment he hadn't been ready to share. His gaze lingered, too long, too deliberate, and I felt my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't in years. "What's up?" he asked, his voice calm, though there was a flicker of something else beneath it, something that matched the tension now coiling in my chest. "The garden lights," I stammered, suddenly unsure of myself. "I think they're still on." "Oh." He leaned casually against the doorframe, his lips curving into a small smile. "I'll take care of it." "Thanks," I said, the word tumbling out too quickly. I started to turn away, but his voice stopped me. "You okay?" I froze, my hand tightening around the glass. "Why wouldn't I be?" He shrugged, his eyes still on me. "You just seem, I don't know, different lately." "Different how?" I asked, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Distracted," he said simply, "like you're carrying something heavy and don't want anyone to notice." His words landed like a soft blow, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He wasn't wrong. He had seen through me in a way that was both startling and disarming. "I'm fine," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "Just tired." "Right," he said, though the way he looked at me made it clear he didn't believe me. When I walked back to the kitchen, I could still feel his eyes on me, as though the weight of his gaze had followed me down the hall. I set the glass in the sink and leaned against the counter, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My heart was pounding, and I hated the way it made me feel, like I was 16 again, awkward and unsure of myself. This was ridiculous. He was my stepson, for God's sake. Well, former stepson, technically. But that distinction didn't matter. It was inappropriate either way, a line I couldn't even think about crossing. And yet, David had moved in 3 months ago, after his messy breakup with a woman he'd been with for nearly 4 years. He'd shown up on my doorstep with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a sheepish smile, asking if he could crash here for a while until he got back on his feet. Of course, I had said yes. What else could I do? He was family. Or at least, he had been once. I had married his father, Jack, when David was still in high school. Our relationship had always been cordial, even warm at times, but there was always a distance between us. Jack had been the bridge that connected us, and when he passed 5 years ago, that bridge crumbled, leaving only the faint outlines of what had been. Having David here again had been an adjustment. He was older now, no longer the lanky teenager I remembered. He carried himself with an ease, a quiet confidence that was both familiar and unsettling. He was still kind, still thoughtful. But there was something else in him now, a sharpness, a depth, that made it impossible to see him as just the boy I used to know. I had convinced myself that his presence in the house was a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But the truth was more complicated. It was the way he lingered in the kitchen after dinner, asking about my day with an attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. The way he'd reach for a dish or a towel, his hand brushing against mine, just long enough to make me wonder if it was intentional. And then there were the moments like tonight, when his gaze lingered too long, and I felt something stir deep inside me. Something I didn't want to name. I poured myself another glass of wine, and took it out to the garden, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. The soft hum of crickets filled the silence, and I tilted my head back, staring at the faint outline of stars against the inky sky. I had spent so many nights out here alone, surrounded by the quiet, letting it wrap around me like a second skin. I had told myself I was content with this solitude, that I didn't need more than what I had. But tonight, the stillness felt heavier than usual, as though it were pressing down on me, filling the empty spaces I had grown so used to. I thought of David, of the way he had looked at me tonight, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. And that realization scared me more than anything else. I thought the moment at his door would fade, like so many other fleeting exchanges between us. But it didn't. It lingered, wrapping itself around the edges of my thoughts, creeping into quiet moments when I was least prepared for it. The way David had looked at me that night wasn't something I could dismiss. It wasn't casual or polite, and it wasn't how someone looks at a person they consider just family. It was charged, raw, and unguarded. And the worst part was, I hadn't turned away from it. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way his eyes had softened, how his voice had lowered, how the air between us had seemed to shift, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my imagination. But my body didn't believe me. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, his hair damp and messy, a half-empty mug of coffee in his hand. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone, looking every bit as relaxed as if he'd lived here his whole life. "Morning," he said without looking up, his voice still warm with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I moved to the kettle. I could feel his eyes on me as I reached for the tea bags, my hand trembling slightly despite my best efforts to appear calm. I hated that he could unnerve me so easily, that his presence could tilt my world off balance with just a look. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, pouring the boiling water over the tea bag. "Fine. You?" "Yeah," he said, his tone almost thoughtful. "Though it's hard to sleep with the garden lights on all night." I froze, the tea bag dangling from my fingers. He was teasing me, but the way he said it, lightly, with a hint of a smile, made me flush. "Very funny," I muttered, busying myself with stirring the tea. He chuckled, the sound low and warm, and I felt the tension in my chest tighten. It wasn't just the mornings. That week, we seemed to find ourselves crossing paths more than usual. In the living room, where he stretched out on the couch with a book, his feet propped up on the coffee table like he owned the place. In the garden, where he offered to help me pull weeds, his hands brushing against mine as we worked side by side. In the hallway, where we'd both step aside at the same time, only to laugh awkwardly when neither of us moved. It was in those moments, the tiny, inconsequential ones, that I felt the pull the strongest. The way his presence filled the space around me, making everything else seem smaller, quieter. The way his voice wrapped around my name when he spoke it, soft and familiar, as if it held a meaning I couldn't quite grasp. And then there were the times I caught him looking at me, not staring exactly, but observing. Like he was trying to figure me out. His gaze wasn't invasive, it was curious, thoughtful, as though he was seeing something I wasn't ready to show. It made my skin prickle, my breath catch. It made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, I found him in the kitchen again, chopping vegetables for dinner. I had been out in the garden, pruning the roses, and the scent of earth and flowers still clung to me as I stepped inside. "Smells good," I said, pausing in the doorway. He glanced up, his smile easy and warm. "Figured I'd help out." "You're always the one cooking." "You don't have to," I said, though the sight of him standing there, sleeves pushed up, knife in hand, sent a wave of warmth through me. "I don't mind," he replied, turning back to the cutting board. I walked to the sink, rinsing my hands under the cool water. The window above the sink was open, letting in the evening breeze, and I could hear the faint hum of crickets outside. "You're good at that," I said, glancing over at him. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "At chopping vegetables?" "At cooking," I clarified, smiling despite myself. He shrugged, his grin widening. "You pick up a thing or two when you live on your own." The comment hung in the air for a moment, a reminder of the life he had before this, the heartbreak that had brought him here. "Do you miss it?" I asked softly. "Sometimes," he admitted, his hands stilling for a moment. "But I don't think I miss her. I think I just miss the idea of it." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. After dinner, we ended up in the living room, a bottle of wine open on the coffee table between us. He was sprawled across the couch, his legs stretched out, while I sat in the armchair, the warm glow of the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Just tired, I replied, taking another sip of wine. You say that a lot, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maybe I am tired, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Or maybe you're just used to keeping everything to yourself, he said, his gaze steady and unflinching. The comment caught me off guard, and I felt my breath hitch. He didn't say it with judgment. It was quiet, observant, like he was stating a fact I couldn't deny. I'm not, I started, but the words faltered. You don't have to pretend with me, he said softly. His words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. Later, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. The quiet intensity in his voice. He was right. I was keeping things to myself. I had been for years, ever since Jack died, ever since the world grew quieter and smaller around me. But now, with David here, everything felt different. The silence didn't feel as comforting anymore. The solitude I had once clung to felt like a weight. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to carry alone any longer. And that terrified me. The following evening was unusually quiet. The rain had started in the late afternoon, a soft drizzle that turned the garden into a shimmering sea of green. I stayed inside, curled up in the living room with a blanket and a book, but the words on the page refused to hold my attention. I could hear David in the kitchen. The faint clatter of dishes and the occasional sound of the faucet turning on and off. He always cleaned up after dinner without being asked, a quiet act of kindness that I had come to rely on more than I cared to admit. Eventually, the silence in the house grew too heavy, and I found myself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching as he dried the last of the plates. He hadn't noticed me yet, his focus on the towel in his hands, and for a moment I just stood there, unsure of what I was doing. Need something? He asked suddenly, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. No, I just thought I'd see if you needed help. He set the plate down and turned to face me, leaning against the counter with an easy confidence that made my stomach tighten. I think I've got it under control, he said, his smile softening. But thanks. I stepped into the kitchen, the sound of rain tapping against the windows filling the quiet between us. You've been restless lately, he said, his tone casual but probing. Something on your mind? Not really, I replied, though the lie felt thin even to me. Come on, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. You're always in motion these days, cleaning, gardening, cooking. It's like you're trying to keep yourself too busy to think. I felt a flicker of irritation at how easily he seemed to see through me, but there was no malice in his voice, just quiet concern. Maybe I just like staying busy, I said, meeting his gaze. Or maybe you're avoiding something, he said softly. His words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. You don't know what you're talking about, I said finally, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. Don't I? He asked, stepping closer. His nearness unsettled me, not because I felt unsafe, but because I felt the exact opposite. There was a warmth in his presence, a quiet steadiness that made it hard to keep my walls up. David, I trailed off, unsure of what I was trying to say. It's okay, he said gently. You don't have to explain, but you don't have to carry everything on your own either. His words were simple, but they cut through me like a blade. I'm not carrying anything, I said quickly, turning away and busying myself with wiping down the already clean counter. You're not a very good liar, he said, his tone light but pointed. I froze, the cloth in my hand trembling slightly. I don't know what you want me to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not asking you to say anything, he said. I just want you to let me in. I turned to face him, my chest tight with emotions I didn't know how to name. Why do you care so much? I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Because I see you, he said simply. Not the version of you that keeps everything together, that smiles and pretends like everything is fine. I see the real you, and I care about her. His honesty left me breathless, and for a moment I couldn't look at him. The weight of his gaze, the raw sincerity in his voice was too much. This isn't right, I said finally, shaking my head. You're my stepson. I'm not your son, he said quietly. That doesn't matter, I replied, though the conviction in my voice faltered. Doesn't it? He asked, stepping closer still. I backed away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as though it could anchor me. You're young, I said, my voice trembling. You have your whole life ahead of you. You shouldn't be wasting your time worrying about me. He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. You think this is about age? About wasting time? Isn't it? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. No, he said firmly. It's about you. It's about the way you light up when you're talking about your garden, or the way you hum to yourself when you're cooking. It's about how you make this house feel alive again, even when you don't realize it. His words broke something in me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. David, this is complicated, I said, my voice breaking. Maybe, he said, his voice softening. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. The room fell silent, the sound of the rain outside the only thing breaking the quiet. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, where it rested on the counter. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If this is something you don't want, just say the word and I'll back off. I promise. I opened my mouth, the words hovering on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't say them. Instead, I looked up at him, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored my own, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. I don't know what I want, I admitted, my voice trembling. He smiled then, a small, understanding smile that made my chest ache. That's okay, he said softly. You don't have to figure it out right now. He stepped back, giving me the space I hadn't realized I needed, and I felt the tension in my chest ease ever so slightly. As he left the kitchen, I stayed where I was, my hand still resting on the counter, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The days that followed felt like walking on a high wire. Every glance, every word exchanged between us was weighted with unspoken meaning. David didn't bring up the conversation in the kitchen, but it lingered, hovering in the air whenever we were in the same room. I tried to pretend everything was normal. I busied myself with cleaning the house, tending to the garden, and burying myself in the comforting monotony of routine. But, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of the way he had looked at me. His voice, soft but certain as he told me I didn't have to carry everything alone. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel about what was happening between us, or how to stop it. It was late one evening, just as the sun was setting, when the tension finally began to unravel. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over my legs and a book in my hands. I wasn't reading it, though. My eyes scanned the same page over and over, the words blurring together as my thoughts drifted elsewhere. The soft sound of footsteps drew my attention, and I glanced up to see David standing in the doorway. He had a glass of wine in one hand and a faint smile on his lips. Mind if I join you? He asked. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure. He crossed the room and sat down on the other end of the couch, setting his glass on the coffee table. He didn't say anything at first, his attention seemingly focused on the glass in his hand. But I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, the quiet intensity of his gaze making my pulse quicken. You've been avoiding me, he said finally, breaking the silence. I have not, I said quickly, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. He tilted his head, his lips curving into a faint smile. You're doing it right now, I sighed, setting the book down on my lap. I'm not avoiding you, I said, more firmly this time. I just don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his voice soft. I just don't want you to feel like you have to run from me. His words sent a jolt through me, and I looked away, focusing on the flickering candle on the coffee table. I'm not running, I said quietly. Aren't you? He asked. I turned to him then, frustration bubbling to the surface. What do you want from me, David? His expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't want anything from you, he said. I just want you to let me be here for you. That's all. The simplicity of his words disarmed me, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Because I care about you, he said, his gaze steady and unflinching. More than I probably should. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, and I felt my breath catch. I shook my head, standing abruptly and wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a shield. "This is wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "Why?" he asked, standing as well. "You know why," I said, my back to him. "No, I don't," he said softly, his voice closer now. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're my stepson, David. Whatever this is, it can't happen." "I'm not your stepson," he said, his tone calm but insistent. "Not anymore. And even if I was, that doesn't change the way I feel about you." His words left me reeling, and I took a step back, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "I've known for a while now, and I think you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew he was right. "You don't understand," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I can't let myself feel this way. It's too much." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, stepping closer. "I'm here. I'll always be here, if you'll let me." His hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine, and I felt a spark shoot through me at the simple touch. "I can't," I began, but the words faltered. "You can," he said softly. "Just let yourself feel it. Just this once." The space between us seemed to disappear, and before I could think better of it, I reached for him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and unsure, but it quickly deepened, his arms wrapping around me as though he was afraid to let go. I felt his hand slide up to cup my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek as he pulled me closer. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in it. In the warmth of his touch, in the way his breath mingled with mine, in the way his presence filled the empty spaces inside me that I hadn't realized were still there. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. "Tell me you didn't feel that," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I closed my eyes, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "I did," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Then don't run from it," he said, his hand still cradling my face. "I don't know how to do this," I said, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Just let me be here for you." I didn't reply. I couldn't. But as I stood there in his arms, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. The storm outside intensified as the night wore on, thunder rolling in deep, rumbling waves that shook the windows. The power flickered once, then went out completely, leaving the house bathed in darkness. I stood frozen in the living room, my breath uneven as the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. David stood across from me, his silhouette barely visible in the faint light from the window. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us, punctuated only by the sound of rain pelting against the glass. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't seem to sort out. I knew I should walk away, retreat to my room, and let the darkness swallow this moment before it grew into something I couldn't control. But my feet stayed planted, and when he finally stepped closer, the space between us disappeared entirely. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice steady but quiet, "but please don't pretend this didn't mean something." His words were a lifeline in the storm of my emotions, pulling me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice trembling. "David, I can't." "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of how much I had been craving even the smallest connection. "Just let me be here." His hand moved to my face then, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheek in a gesture so tender it brought tears to my eyes. "I see you," he murmured, his forehead resting lightly against mine. "And I care about you. More than I probably should, but I can't pretend otherwise anymore." I closed my eyes, my chest tightening at the raw vulnerability in his voice. Every part of me wanted to push him away, to put an end to this before it went any further. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to step back, to break the fragile connection we had created. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the front of his shirt as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "This is crazy," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Maybe," he said, his breath warm against my skin, "but it doesn't make it any less real." The next moment happened so quickly, so effortlessly, that I didn't even realize what I had done until it was over. My lips found his, tentative at first, as though I were testing the waters of something I knew I couldn't take back. His response was immediate, his arms wrapping around me and pulling me closer, his kiss deepening with a fervor that made my knees weak. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an unraveling, a release of everything I had been holding back for so long. I felt his hands slide down to my waist, his touch firm but careful, as though he were afraid I might slip away. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the intensity of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. "Are you sure?" he murmured against my lips, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," I whispered, the word escaping before I could second-guess it. The living room became our sanctuary, the storm outside raging on as if in harmony with the chaos inside me. He guided me to the couch, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to stop him, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the warmth and security of his arms. His hands moved with quiet reverence, exploring the curves of my body in a way that made me feel cherished, wanted, alive. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my chest ache. It was the way he whispered my name, soft and reverent, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time in years, I let myself be vulnerable. I let myself feel. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a reminder of what I had been missing, of what I had convinced myself I didn't need. And as the night stretched on, I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to crumble, piece by piece. He was patient, attentive, his every movement a quiet promise that he would never take more than I was willing to give. And in that moment, I gave him everything. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint light of the candles casting soft shadows across the room. His fingers traced lazy patterns along my arm, and I felt a warmth bloom in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and steady. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so." He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be." I didn't reply, but his words stayed with me as the storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant. For the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough. As I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring, and whether I had the courage to face it. For now, though, I let myself savor the moment, the warmth of his embrace and the faint stirrings of hope that had begun to take root in my chest. Morning came slowly, the pale light filtering through the curtains casting soft golden hues across the room. I woke to the sound of rain dripping lazily from the gutters, a faint echo of the storm that had raged the night before. For a moment I didn't move. I stayed curled on the couch, my head resting against David's chest, his arm draped loosely over me. His breathing was slow and steady, his warmth anchoring me in a way I hadn't felt in years. But then, reality began to creep in. Its edges sharp and unrelenting. The memories of the night before were vivid, undeniable, and the weight of them settled heavily in my chest. I slipped out of his arms carefully, not wanting to wake him. As I stood, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders, I glanced down at him. He looked so peaceful. His features softened in sleep, and for a moment I let myself linger. But then I turned and walked to the kitchen, my steps quiet against the wooden floor. The house felt different that morning. Quieter, heavier. I made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual grounding me as my thoughts swirled in endless circles. I had spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need anything more than the life I had. That solitude was safer, easier. But last night had changed something. It had cracked open a part of me I thought had been sealed off forever, and now I didn't know how to put it back. The tea grew cold in my hands as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the rain-soaked garden. My mind replayed every moment, every touch, every whispered word from the night before. And though a part of me wanted to cling to the warmth of those memories, another part of me was terrified of what they meant. What happens now? The question loomed, heavy and unanswerable. I was still lost in thought when I heard his footsteps behind me. "Hey," David said softly, his voice still thick with sleep. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair mussed and his t-shirt wrinkled. He looked at me with a small, hesitant smile, as though he wasn't sure what to expect. "Morning," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You left early." "I needed some air," I replied, wrapping my hands around the mug as though it could shield me from the weight of the conversation. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. David didn't reply right away. Instead, he walked over to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "You can talk to me," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're thinking, I'm here." His words made my chest ache, and I looked down at my tea, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what to do, David. I don't even know what to think." He reached across the table then, his hand brushing against mine. The gesture was simple, but it grounded me, pulling me out of the storm of my thoughts. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said. "But I meant what I said last night. I'm here, for as long as you'll let me be." The sincerity in his voice was overwhelming, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't just about me," I said, my voice trembling. "People will talk, they'll judge, and I don't know if I can handle that." "I don't care what people think," he said firmly. "What matters to me is you. How you feel what you want." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I let myself believe them. I let myself imagine a future where I could let go of the fear, the guilt, the weight of everyone else's expectations. But the fear was still there, whispering all the reasons why this couldn't work. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, his hand tightening around mine. "But you don't have to go through this alone." The warmth of his touch, the quiet conviction in his voice, made something stir deep inside me. A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. We sat there in silence for a long time, the rain outside softening to a gentle drizzle. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But as I looked across the table at David, his gaze steady and unwavering, I felt a quiet sense of possibility begin to take root. For so long, I had told myself that this chapter of my life was over, that the best I could hope for was quiet contentment. But now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe there was still more to write. Maybe, just maybe, I could let myself hope again. When David finally stood, his hand brushing against mine one last time before he turned toward the door, I felt a warmth bloom in my chest. "Take your time," he said softly, his smile warm and genuine. "I'm not going anywhere." As the door closed behind him, I sat alone in the quiet, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket. For the first time in years, the stillness didn't feel so heavy. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to give up on it just yet. When I saw Nate holding the vibrator from my package, his face a mix of shock and curiosity, I felt my heart stop. The moment felt endless. He stood there in the living room, the open box of items on the coffee table, holding something no stepson should ever see. His eyes darted between the object in his hand and me as I froze in the doorway, clutching a basket of folded laundry. Evelyn," he stammered, his voice breaking the unbearable silence. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped, setting the basket down with trembling hands. My cheeks burned, a mix of anger and humiliation washing over me as I crossed the room, snatching the item from his hand. "I didn't mean," Nate began, stepping back defensively. "I didn't know what it was. The package was just sitting here and You thought you'd open it?" I cut him off, slamming the rest of the items back into the box and snapping the lid shut. "You had no right, none, to touch it." Nate ran a hand through his hair, his face redder than I'd ever seen it. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I thought it was like tools or something." "Tools?" I echoed, incredulous. "Does this look like tools to you?" He glanced at the now closed box, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for a response. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice low. I wasn't trying to. Just forget about it, I interrupted, clutching the box tightly as I turned toward the stairs. Forget this ever happened. But as I stormed out of the room, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't just embarrassment or guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. The incident replayed in my mind over and over as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Nate had apologized, sure, but something about the way he'd looked at me, confused, unsure, lingering just a second too long, stuck with me. And then there was me. My reaction had been more than just embarrassment. It was anger at myself, at the vulnerability that came with someone knowing something so private about me. Carl, my husband, had never even asked about my needs. Hell, he barely noticed when I was in the same room anymore. Those items in the package, they were a small rebellion, a way to reclaim some sense of control over my neglected life. But now, Nate knew. And knowing him, he wasn't going to forget. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, staring into his coffee cup like it held all the answers in the world. When he looked up and saw me, his posture stiffened. About yesterday, he started, his voice cautious. Drop it, I said quickly, pouring myself a cup of tea and keeping my back to him. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he continued, ignoring my attempt to shut him down. I shouldn't have opened it. It's none of my business. You're right, I said sharply, turning to face him. It's not. He nodded, the tension thick between us. It won't happen again. Good. But even as I said the word, I could feel his eyes on me. And I knew this wasn't over. It had been 3 weeks since Nate opened that package, but the awkwardness between us lingered like a shadow in the house. For the most part, we danced around each other, pretending nothing had happened, though I could feel his presence in every room. And when our paths crossed, whether it was in the kitchen, the living room, or the garden, the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Carl, of course, remained oblivious. My husband had mastered the art of distraction, burying himself in work and hobbies, to the point where he barely noticed the tension simmering beneath the surface. That was the story of our marriage, really. 2 people sharing a house but living entirely separate lives. Carl and I had married when I was 46, after a whirlwind romance that now felt like a lifetime ago. At the time, I thought he was everything I wanted. Successful, charming, stable. But stability has a way of turning into monotony, and as the years passed, his attention drifted elsewhere. He was always on the phone, always in meetings, always too tired to notice when I dressed up or asked him about his day. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that this was just what marriage looked like after so many years. But when I found myself ordering that package, an act born out of loneliness and quiet defiance, I knew something had shifted. And then Nate moved back in. Nate was nothing like Carl. Where Carl was rigid and predictable, Nate was easygoing, spontaneous, curious. He had a way of making the house feel alive again, whether it was through the music he played while cooking or the stories he told about his failed tech startup. At 25, he was still trying to figure things out, though Carl wasn't shy about reminding him that he needed to get his act together. Nate took the criticism in stride, shrugging it off with a grin and a joke that usually made me laugh despite myself. You know, Evelyn, he said one afternoon as we worked side by side in the garden, my dad acts like he's got it all figured out, but half the time, I don't think he even knows what he's saying. I laughed, shaking my head. You shouldn't talk about your father like that. Why not? He said, smirking. It's not like he listens to me anyway. His honesty was refreshing, disarming even. And though I tried to keep our conversations light, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing something I didn't even realize I was showing. The first real shift happened one evening when Carl was out of town on a business trip. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Nate walked in. He lingered by the counter, watching me as I scrubbed the dishes. Need help? He asked. I've got it, I said, glancing at him. But thanks. He didn't leave. Instead, he grabbed a towel and started drying the plates I handed him. For a while, we worked in silence, the rhythmic clinking of dishes the only sound in the room. Then he spoke. Evelyn, he said, his voice low, about the package. I stiffened, my hands pausing in the soapy water. I thought we agreed to drop it. I know, he said quickly, but I can't stop thinking about it. I turned to face him, my heart racing. There's nothing to think about, Nate. It was a mistake, an accident. He set the towel down, his gaze steady. Was it? Yes, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. You don't have to pretend with me, you know? I see how he treats you, how lonely you are. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. You deserve more, he said softly. I shook my head, stepping back. This conversation is over. But as I walked out of the kitchen, I couldn't ignore the way my chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The tension only grew after that night. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark, and I found myself avoiding Nate whenever I could. But it didn't matter. He was everywhere. In the kitchen, in the garden, even in my dreams. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, he appeared in the doorway. Evelyn, he said, his voice quiet. I looked up, my hands stilling over the towel in my lap. What is it? He hesitated, leaning against the doorframe. Do you ever think about leaving? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Leaving? This house. My dad. All of it, he said, his tone measured. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. Where would I go? Anywhere, he said, his eyes locking on mine. You don't have to stay here if you're not happy. His words sent a jolt through me, and I looked away, focusing on the towel in my hands. It's not that simple, Nate. Maybe it is, he said softly. When I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. And in that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. It happened on a stormy night. The kind where the rain lashes against the windows and the house feels quieter than usual. Carl had called earlier to say he'd be staying late at work again. That left just me and Nate, sitting in the living room with the faint hum of the television playing in the background. He was sprawled on the couch, his long legs stretched out, while I sat in the armchair, a book open in my lap that I hadn't read a single word of. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and tonight it felt unbearable. You don't have to keep pretending, you know, Nate said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I looked up from my book, startled. Pretending? That you're okay, he said, sitting up now, his eyes locked on mine. That everything in your life is fine. It's not. I set the book down, my heart racing. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, he said, his tone soft but insistent. You don't have to lie to me, Evelyn. I see you. I've always seen you. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This is inappropriate, I said, standing abruptly. I think you should. Why do you do that? He interrupted, standing as well. Do what? I asked, my voice trembling. Push people away, he said, stepping closer. You deserve to be happy, Evelyn. You deserve to feel alive. I shook my head, backing away. This is wrong, Nate. You know that. Is it? He asked, his gaze steady. Because it doesn't feel wrong to me. Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. You don't have to be afraid, he said softly. Not with me. And then he kissed me. The first kiss was tentative, hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally broke apart, my heart was pounding, and I stared at him, unsure of what to say. We can't do this, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I know, he said quietly, but I don't regret it. Neither did I, though I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I turned and left the room, my mind spinning. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We tried to act normal when Carl was around, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, Nate appeared behind me, his presence sending a shiver down my spine. Evelyn, he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my breath catching at the look in his eyes. What is it? He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. We shouldn't, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I know, he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. But I can't stop thinking about you. Neither could I. The affair escalated quickly. It was like a dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood. One night, while Carl was away on a business trip, Nate and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, though my hands trembled with every book I touched. "Do you ever feel trapped?" he asked, breaking the silence. I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "Like you're living someone else's life," he said, his voice quiet. I hesitated before nodding. "All the time." He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You don't have to stay here, Evelyn. You don't have to stay with him." "I don't have a choice," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "There's always a choice," he said, his hand reaching for mine. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and before I knew it, I was in his arms, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left me breathless. We were careful, or at least we tried to be. But the secrecy only made it more exhilarating. One afternoon, while Carl was at the office, Nate and I were in the garden, hidden behind the tall rose bushes. I laughed as he reached for a pair of pruning shears, his hand brushing against mine. "You're terrible at this," I teased. "Maybe I just like the company," he said, his tone playful. The moment shifted as he stepped closer, his hand lingering on mine. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. But as thrilling as our affair was, it came with its share of risks. One evening, while Carl was out with friends, I found myself in Nate's room. We were sitting on his bed, talking in hushed tones, when we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "Shit," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. Nate grabbed my hand, his expression serious. "Go, I'll cover for you." I nodded, slipping out of his room and down the hall just as Carl walked through the front door. My heart was racing, but I managed to keep my composure as I greeted him in the foyer. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. "Poker got canceled," he replied, his tone distracted. "Where's Nate?" "In his room, I think," I said quickly, hoping he wouldn't notice the flush in my cheeks. Carl nodded, heading toward the kitchen, and I let out a shaky breath, relieved that we'd avoided disaster. But we couldn't avoid it forever. The closer Nate and I grew, the more difficult it became to hide. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets have a way of unraveling. No matter how carefully you try to keep them hidden, the weight of them pulls at the seams of your life until everything begins to fray. For weeks, Nate and I thought we were in control, but the cracks were beginning to show. It started with Lila, Carl's business partner, who had a habit of stopping by unannounced. "Lila's here," Carl said one Saturday afternoon, his voice carrying through the house as I stood in the kitchen preparing lunch. I froze for a moment, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. Lila had a reputation for being nosy, and the thought of her snooping around the house sent a chill down my spine. "Tell her I'll be right out," I called back, forcing my voice to stay steady. When I walked into the living room a few minutes later, Lila was perched on the edge of the couch, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Evelyn," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So good to see you." "You too, Lila," I replied, sitting down across from her. She leaned back, crossing her legs. "Carl tells me Nate's been staying with you. How's that going?" "Fine," I said quickly. "He's been a big help around the house." "I'll bet," she said, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "It must be nice having someone around while Carl's at work all the time." The implication in her words was clear, and I felt my chest tighten. "We're just glad we can support him while he figures things out," I said, keeping my tone light. Lila's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "Of course." That evening I told Nate about the conversation. "She knows something," I said, pacing the length of the library as he sat on the couch watching me. "She's guessing," Nate replied, his tone calm. "She doesn't have anything concrete." "She doesn't need anything concrete," I shot back. "She just needs Carl to start asking questions." Nate stood, crossing the room to place his hands on my shoulders. "We're careful, Evelyn. She can't prove anything." His touch was reassuring, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to loosen. Then, there was Matt, Nate's childhood friend who had recently moved back to town. He showed up one afternoon while Carl was at work, his arrival unannounced but not entirely surprising. "Matt," Nate said, his voice filled with genuine surprise as he opened the door. "Thought I'd stop by," Matt said with a grin, clapping Nate on the shoulder. "Catch up for a bit." I was in the kitchen when they walked in, and the sight of Matt made my stomach churn. He had a sharpness to him, a perceptiveness that made me uneasy. "Evelyn," he said, his grin widening as he saw me. "Still as lovely as ever." "Matt," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a while." Nate glanced at me, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Matt. "Let's catch up outside," he said quickly, steering his friend toward the patio. But even from the kitchen, I could hear snippets of their conversation. "She's different than I remember," Matt was saying. "Don't start," Nate replied, his tone warning. "Relax," Matt said, laughing. "I'm just saying. You've been spending a lot of time here, haven't you?" "What's your point?" Nate asked, his voice tight. "Nothing," Matt said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just be careful, man. People talk." The tension in the house was reaching a breaking point. Carl was growing more suspicious, Lila's visits were becoming more frequent, and Matt's prying had left Nate on edge. One evening, while Carl was out with Lila at a business dinner, Nate and I were in the library, our usual refuge. "We can't keep this up," I said, my voice trembling. "We've been careful," Nate said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Not careful enough," I replied, pacing the room. "Carl's starting to notice, and Lila doesn't know anything," Nate interrupted, his tone firm. "She doesn't have to," I said, my voice rising. "She just has to say the right thing to Carl, and everything will fall apart." Nate stood, crossing the room to take my hands in his. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "We always do." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of our secret was becoming too much to bear. The breaking point came 2 days later. Carl came home early from work, his expression dark as he walked into the house. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when he appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his tone cold. I set down the dish I was holding, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" "I had lunch with Lila today," he said, crossing his arms. "She told me some interesting things." I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Like what?" "Like how you and Nate have been spending a lot of time together," he said, his eyes narrowing. "More than usual." "He's my stepson, Carl," I said quickly. "Of course we spend time together." "Don't play dumb, Evelyn," he snapped. "Lila thinks there's something going on, and now I'm starting to wonder if she's right." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his accusation hung in the air, and for the first time I felt the walls closing in. That night, I found Nate in his room, packing a bag. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Leaving," he said shortly, not looking at me. "You can't," I said, stepping closer. "I have to," he replied, his voice breaking. "It's only a matter of time before he finds out, and if he does—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I won't let him hurt you," I said, my eyes filling with tears. Nate turned to face me, his expression softening. "You can't protect me, Evelyn, not from this." Before I could respond, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "I'll call you," he said quietly. And then he was gone. For the first few days after Nate left, the house felt impossibly quiet. I went through the motions, cleaning, cooking, pretending to watch television, but every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of him. Carl, oblivious as ever, treated Nate's abrupt departure as a sign of his son finally taking responsibility for his life. But I knew better. Nate had left to protect us, or at least to protect me. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, no matter how far you try to bury them. It began with Carl acting strangely, more distant than usual, but not in his typical preoccupied way. He wasn't spending time in his study or watching his financial news shows like he always did. Instead, he spent hours on his laptop in the evenings, shutting the screen any time I walked by. One night, after he went to bed, I crept into the study and turned on his computer, curious about what he was hiding. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Dozens of emails between Carl and Lila, the subject lines vague, but the tone unmistakably conspiratorial. "Lila, I'll dig deeper and see if anyone else noticed anything. Let me know what you find. I'm starting to think I was blind to all of it." The implication was clear. They were watching me. I didn't tell Nate, I couldn't. He had left to protect me, and dragging him back into this mess felt selfish. But as the days passed, Carl's suspicion grew more overt. "You've been quiet lately," he said one morning over breakfast, his tone too casual. "I'm always quiet," I replied, keeping my eyes on my plate. He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "True, but something feels off, don't you think?" I looked up at him, forcing a smile. I don't know what you mean. Carl leaned back in his chair, studying me. You're sure there's nothing you want to tell me? My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. Nothing at all. A week later, the real twist came. I was in the garden trimming the roses when Matt showed up. He leaned on the fence, watching me with an expression that made my skin crawl. Long time no see, he said, his tone teasing. What do you want, Matt? I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. Just checking in, he said, shrugging. Nate's been staying at my place, you know. That made me freeze. He has? Matt smirked. He didn't tell you? Interesting. I set down the pruning shears, my patience wearing thin. Is there a point to this visit, or are you just here to waste my time? His smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Lila came to see me, he said. The blood drained from my face. What did she want? To know if I'd noticed anything strange between you and Nate, he said bluntly. And what did you tell her? I asked, my voice trembling. Relax, Matt said, holding up his hands. I didn't say anything, but I figured you should know she's digging. That evening, I received a message from Nate. I think Matt knows something. Be careful. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. If Matt was talking to Lila, it was only a matter of time before Carl confronted me. It happened sooner than I expected. Carl came home early one afternoon, his expression cold and unreadable. He found me in the living room, folding laundry, and sat down across from me without a word. Carl? I asked, uneasy. Lila told me something interesting today, he said, his voice dangerously calm. I set down the laundry, my heart pounding. What did she say? She said she overheard Matt talking about you and Nate, he replied, his gaze piercing. About how close the two of you had gotten. That's ridiculous, I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Is it? Carl asked, leaning forward. Because I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. How Nate moved in and suddenly you seemed different, happier, distracted. I shook my head, my chest tightening. You're imagining things, Carl. Am I? He snapped, his voice rising. Because I don't think I am, Evelyn. I think there's something you're not telling me. I stood, my hands trembling. You're being paranoid. Am I? He repeated, standing as well. Or have you been lying to me this whole time? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the doorbell rang. I wasn't prepared for who was standing on the other side of the door. Nate, what are you doing here? I whispered, my heart racing as I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me. I had to see you, he said, his expression tense. Matt's been acting weird. I think he's trying to set you up. Carl already knows something, I said, my voice shaking. He confronted me just now. Nate's jaw tightened. Then we need to tell him the truth, before someone else does. You don't understand, I said, my eyes filling with tears. If he finds out, he'll. Evelyn? Carl's voice called from inside. I turned, panic flooding through me. What's going on out here? Carl asked, stepping onto the porch. His eyes flicked between me and Nate, and I could see the pieces falling into place in his mind. Carl, I can explain, I began, but he held up a hand to silence me. You don't need to, he said, his voice cold. I've heard enough. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Carl demanded answers, his voice echoing through the house as he accused me of betraying him. Nate tried to defend me, but his presence only made things worse. By the time Carl stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, I was left trembling and unsure of what to do next. Nate placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steadying me. We'll figure this out, he said quietly. But as I looked at him, I knew the damage had already been done. Carl didn't come home that night. I paced the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. Nate sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together as he watched me with a mixture of worry and determination. You should go, I said, stopping mid-step to look at him. No, he replied firmly, shaking his head. I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone. This isn't your fight, Nate, I said, my voice trembling. It's mine. He stood, stepping toward me. It's our fight, he said softly. I won't abandon you, Evelyn. The tenderness in his voice nearly broke me, but before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent my heart into a spiral. It's him, I whispered. Nate tensed, his jaw tightening as he moved closer to me. Whatever happens, I'm here. The front door swung open moments later, and Carl walked in. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and the look on his face was a storm of anger and betrayal. He stopped in the entryway, his eyes locking onto me first, then shifting to Nate. "I thought I made myself clear," Carl said coldly, his gaze hardening. "You were supposed to leave." "Carl, please," I said, stepping forward. "Let's talk about this." "Talk?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You want to talk now, after everything?" He turned to Nate, his hands curling into fists. "How long has this been going on?" Nate didn't flinch. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," Carl shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I didn't see the way you looked at her? The way she looked at you?" "It's my fault," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "Don't blame him. I'll blame whoever I damn well want," Carl snapped, his eyes blazing. "You betrayed me, Evelyn, both of you." Nate stepped in front of me, his body shielding mine. "If you want to blame someone, blame me," he said firmly. "But don't take it out on her." Carl laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Listen to you, acting like some kind of hero. You're nothing but a spoiled little boy playing house with someone else's wife." "Stop it," I shouted, my voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't helping anyone." Carl turned to me, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Do you even care what you've done? You've destroyed this family." I stared at him, tears streaming down my face. This family was broken long before Nate came home. You just didn't want to see it. For a moment, Carl said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned and grabbed his coat from the rack. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," he said, slamming the door behind him. When the sound of his car faded into the night, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. Nate sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders, his presence steadying me, even as my world crumbled. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. But as I looked at him, I couldn't help but wonder if we already had too much to lose.